Hey folks, Dan here. Hope you recognize me. Got a little haircut for the summer. Wanted to talk about Lambic today and calling our beer, our sour beer that we make, either as homebrewers or commercial brewers, calling it Lambic. Should we call it Lambic? Can we call it Lambic legally? The short answer to should we call it Lambic is no, if you don't want to watch the rest of this video. And of course that goes for all the derivative Lambic styles such as Kriek, Framboise, Goose. Kriek is a cherry Lambic, Framboise is raspberry Lambic, Goose is a blend of Lambics. So how did I get to the conclusion that we shouldn't call our sour beer Lambic? Well, it's a complicated subject, so let's talk about it a little bit, and you can make up your own mind. So what's the big deal with Lambic anyway? Why does it matter? Well, to understand that, you have to understand how it's brewed, and we also have to talk a little bit about the formalized definitions of Lambic. So Lambic has four processes that kind of separate it from other brewing processes. The first be turbid mashing. So turbid mash is similar to a decoction, except the starches aren't converted to sugars. So the resulting wort is very cloudy, very starchy. And those starches get broken down over 6 to 12 months or even longer in the barrels by Pediococcus and Brettanomyces. Pediococcus will slowly break down the starches and produce lactic acid. That slow production of lactic acid reacts with the Brettanomyces, and the Brettanomyces makes a lot of complex flavors over that long period of flavor development. So the second part is the boil. The boil takes 4 hours to boil out all the water that was used during the turbid mash. Also during that time they'll use aged hops that are aged for 2 to 3 years. Doing that degenerates the alpha acids in the hops, but the beta acids remain, and the oxidized beta acids provide a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of protection against certain bacteria. So that's also a unique thing with Lambic brewing. The third thing, and probably the most important thing, is after the boil, they'll run the wort into what's called a coolship, which is a wide open fermenter that is open to all the air in the brewery. Sometimes they'll open the windows to the brewery, and they'll cool the wort overnight, usually during the winter, and whatever is in the air inoculates that wort. And so for the first couple of days there's a lot of bad bacteria, actually, Clostridium and E. coli and all kinds of things. The study showed that there was thousands of different species of bacteria and yeasts during the first couple of days. But soon after the fermentation kicks off, the pH is lowered and most of that stuff is killed. However, the first couple of days arguably provides flavor compounds that will develop later on during the beer's aging process. So that plays a role in the flavor development of Lambic. And then the fourth thing is that they're run off into barrels. Those barrels may contain some cultures in them, even though they're steam cleaned usually, but there might be cultures left in the barrels. The barrels are selected for good barrels will stay and bad barrels will be destroyed. And then the final part is that Lambic is usually blended, at least to some degree, and that blending provides a lot of the flavor, the complexity that you get out of Lambic. So the production of Lambic is very complex and results in a very complex beer, and arguably it can't be reproduced with other brewing methods. Although you can produce Lambic style beer without turbid mashing and some of the other things, but really the spontaneous fermentation is what really makes Lambic Lambic. So that's how Lambic is made. Now, how is it really defined? A lot of people say that Lambic can only be made in Belgium, in the Seine Valley. However, there are Lambic brewers in Belgium outside of the Seine Valley. So one of the arguments is that the local flora, the local microbes that live in the Seine Valley, are the only microbes that can make Lambic. That's shown not to be true. There's been studies at American coolship breweries that have coolships in America producing the same style of beer, and it's the same species of microbes that are used in those, or that get inoculated in those breweries. So there's nothing truly special about the microorganisms in Belgium versus anywhere else in the world. Now, there might be some terroir, if you will, with strains of species. Different lambic brewers in Belgium and in the Seine Valley River produce different tasting lambic. And that might be because there are subtle differences between those microorganisms, although when it comes down to it, they're all similar in species. So when you're defining something like a beer style, you want to define it based on some sort of authority. Well, there's kind of two authorities really that I could find. The main authority is HORL. HORL stands for the High Council of Traditional Lambic Beers. And HORL is comprised of most of the lambic brewers in Belgium, minus one very important brewery, which is Cantillon, who is arguably the most reputable lambic brewer in Belgium. The reasons that he hasn't joined HORL are because he doesn't agree with some of their definitions of lambic. So you can see there's even disagreement within Belgium as to what exactly can be called lambic. Now, HORL says that lambic does have to come from Belgium, and Jean Van Waa from Cantillon, the owner and brewer, agrees with that part of the definition. However, there's no real law to say that regionally it has to come from Belgium. Lambic does fall under what is called the Traditional Specialties Guaranteed, which means that it has to be produced in a certain way, but it doesn't give it a regional definition. So it does say that it has to be spontaneously fermented, but still the TSG doesn't define it having to come from Belgium. So there's no real appellation like in Champagne or cognac or trade agreements like there are for bourbons and things like that that give lambic that regional authority that it has to be brewed in Belgium. They can apply for lambic brewers can apply to have a label that says that it is from Belgium, but there's nothing legally really preventing American brewers commercially to label their beer as lambic. So why then don't American brewers call their beer lambic? I mean, there are a few commercial brewers that do call their beer lambic outside of Belgium, but most of them don't. Now, if you look at the Brewers Association guidelines, which is the brewing guidelines that the GABF uses, basically all American commercial brewers use the Brewers Association beer guidelines to classify their beer styles. They call it Belgian style lambic, and they say that it can't be labeled lambic unless it comes from Belgium. So that's the American Brewers Association stance on it. Now, the BJCP kind of throws a wrench in it a little bit. The BJCP, which is the homebrewers style guideline, it's not updated as often as the BA's style guideline, which is ran by professionals. You know, the BJCP is run by volunteers, homebrewers, and it recently just got an update in 2015. Previously, it hasn't been updated since 2008. So there's a little bit less attention to detail possibly taken to this. I'm not too sure. But the BJCP doesn't mention anything about lambic having to be brewed in Belgium. And I think that's a little bit misleading myself. I can understand why they probably do it, to give homebrewers a style to compete in if they make something that's very similar to lambic. But the bottom line is that most commercial brewers don't call their spontaneously fermented beer in cool ships and then aged in barrels and blended just like Belgian lambic. They don't call it lambic. Russian River, for example, calls it Sonambic, which is kind of a play on their location, the Sonoma Valley. Allagash just calls them cool ship beers. Jester King calls them 100% spontaneous cool ship brews. Now, Funk Factory Gouzeria calls them American lambics. So he uses the word lambic, but he prefaces it with American lambic. So there's a bit of a compromise happening on that labeling philosophy. But in the end, none of us, homebrewers or commercial brewers, should label our beer as lambic. And it's purely out of respect. There's no other real reason for it. There's no real difference in the microorganisms in Belgium versus the United States or any other part of the world. and the process can be duplicated by anybody. So the only real reason to not call your beer Lambic is purely out of respect for this style that has been around for hundreds of years and is still being brewed the same way as it was brewed hundreds of years. And its complexity and its uniqueness should definitely be respected. So that's my opinion. I hope you learned something by this. There's going to be a couple links in the comments or in the About section below. If you want to do some more research on Lambic, for example, you'll want to get the book Wild Brews by Jeff Sparrows, and also visit www.lambic.info. That's a wiki that's been put together that has extensive information on Lambic, how to brew it, the different breweries, the history of it, all of that stuff. Cheers, guys. I hope that this was informative and useful for you. Cheers.